So as you can see, the title of this talk is The Importance of Polysaccharides and Other Phytonutrients for Cognition, Immune Function, and Other Mechanisms of Action. I will most heavily focus on the polysaccharide aspect of this talk just because this is mine and my colleagues' work and what I'm most comfortable with talking about. The phytonutrients at the end are related to a different formulation that I'm working on that Dr. Clearfield mentioned, but and I won't, just for the sake of our CME, I won't say the name of my company. I'll ignore that for now. I always like to acknowledge Dr. McDaniel, Dr. Reg McDaniel, and Miss Barbara Kimley, the two people really turned me on to the value of polysaccharides. Dr. McDaniel from the aloe vera side and Miss Kimley from the rice bran side. I also want to thank our sponsors and the people who participated in all of our studies over the extent of and course of my research career. And of course, Dr. Clearfield, I'm grateful for him inviting me to this lecture tonight. Very broadly speaking, obviously, this talk being about certain aspects of nutrition, I think, it goes back to even Hippocrates, where he recognized the value of food and diet way before our calendar started, way before the scientific method, technology, anything else. This guy had an incredible capacity to understand the meaning of food and diet and what that meant for us. Much more recently, in the 1700s, Dr. James Lind was the guy who discovered that if you used citrus, limes, lemons, and oranges, you could not only prevent scurvy, but you could actually reverse it. And his discovery allowed the British to dominate for at least a couple of centuries around the world. Certainly his discovery, I think you'd have to give a lot of credit for one of the reasons why we speak English in the United States today, and just really was something that, truly was profound. And I like to point out both of these things as I begin this talk about nutrition, simply to show that the idea that food is medicine or food heals us or nutrition heals us is not a new concept, right? I mean, this has been around for many, many years. So this isn't anything that I would talk about today, certainly is nothing new. I may have new aspects to this story to bring to the table, but in terms of the general concept, this is absolutely nothing new. This has been around for literally millennia. The standard American diet, there's nothing about anything that I could teach you guys in your practice or what you do with your patients or your clients that you don't already know related to SAD, the standard American diet. What the typical American is doing to his or her health today is just really, it quite frankly, in what I've seen in my lifetime, is just literally astounding to me when you look at the data. So you have all of these factors related to ultimately, and lots of people make this comment as well today, that the average person is overfed and undernourished. You're, so focused on getting all of this macronutrition, but then meanwhile, the micronutrition is almost entirely ignored. And this is the reason, again, why we have epidemics of all these different chronic diseases today. I mean, just take your pick. Literally any of these and all of these are strongly related, if not entirely, almost entirely related to everything that we put into our mouths. So the idea that we are now literally going down the tubes, I mean, to me, we have so many political and societal issues at work against us today in our country. But if you think about chronic disease being right there at the top of the list, I mean, it's arguably, if not the top 2 or 3 issues that we face. I mean, I don't know what else is above it. The sufficiency in one micronutrient, we can make up for that in the short term, either for survival or for even reproduction purposes. But what we do is then we kick in these unfortunate mechanisms where we ultimately sacrifice our long-term health, and we subject ourselves to greater risk of all these things that are killing us that I've mentioned in the previous slide. So if you look at all these different micronutrients that Ames lists, there's, as you can see here in the second point, there are about 40 of them that are ultimately, crucial for our survival. So again, our body's inherent intelligence has the capacity to deal with these short-term shortages. But then if we neglect those for a long enough period of time, ultimately his theory, according to the triage theory, is that we will end up succumbing to either cancer, heart disease, diabetes, something along those lines. And so he's he's done such a masterful job of breaking down many of these different insufficiencies or deficiencies. The very common theme, if you just look at these, and I'm not going to read them one by one, but a very common theme here among all of these is immune dysfunction combined with neurodegeneration. And that sort of leads me into where I'm going with presenting to you guys the research that my colleagues and I have conducted. But it's just fascinating when you start, putting all of these societal factors together down to the individual level, down to each one of us as individuals, and then how this all relates together. It's just really fascinating from that perspective. I'm sure many of you, I'm singing to the chorus here in terms of the use of dietary supplements when, we think of how they fit into the role of, what we do every day. And again, I've been the person who 20 years ago went from thinking, oh, you could get everything from food, to having a completely different view of that, certainly based on a lot of my research, but just in general related to some of those other factors that I've mentioned. But according to the Institute of Medicine, we have about 80,000 supplements on the market today. There's roughly 1,000 new products that get introduced into the market every day. If you look at what has happened in our industry, going back to 1994 with the passage of the DSHEA Act, and that of course gives us the legal ability to utilize structure function claims around nutrition. And of course, maybe this is a good time to say that I never want anybody to say, well, Lewis said you could use nutrition to treat, cure, manage, or mitigate disease. I never say that. I'm always very aware and mindful of the FTC and the FDA and how they frown and really come down on people who do that. But since the DSHEA Act was passed in 1994, you can see that our industry just continues growing, even with, say, for example, the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, the real estate bubble around 2008, 2009. And then, of course, this is all information prior to COVID, but nonetheless, our industry just continues going up. It doesn't abate. And so what these revenue numbers tell me is that, more and more people are continuing to look for information in the use of a dietary supplement. And again, here are some of NHANES's latest data related to dietary supplement use. You can see in the first bullet, among American adults at least 20 years of age and older, almost 60% used at least one dietary supplement in the past 30 days. And then the typical dietary supplement user in the United States is an older non-Hispanic white female who is physically active and has a generally higher than average level of education. So these are very significant numbers. And I think this speaks to, the popularity of using dietary supplements in terms of the relationship between all this exploding chronic disease, people recognizing the conventional medical perspective is either insufficient or lacking in efficacy. And so what else can we use to fill in those gaps or to try to, come up with some new strategy or some new methodology? So I think these numbers are just incredibly significant, and I'm sure I'm singing to the chorus with a lot of you on this session tonight. So again, I want to present to you guys this ongoing research program that my colleagues and I have had going for close to 16 years now, 17 years. It's hard to believe it's been this long period of my life, but nonetheless, I'm very proud of this work. And if you guys think I'm bragging a little bit, I probably am, just because again, it's work that has completely changed my life. And again, I'm continuing to go down this track, and hopefully we'll be able to do more research in the future as more funds come into play for that. But the polysaccharides that I've really focused on, as I mentioned just a moment ago, are most specifically related to the aloe vera and the rice bran. And of course, with aloe vera, I'll just make a few opening comments or points about this. I think most people, when you mention the plant aloe vera, most people think, oh, well, that's a great solution for either a sunburn or a wound or a cut or something topical. And I'm not debating that. That's certainly a fine application. But when you take the polysaccharides out of the inner leaf gel, which is in the middle of that, if you see the cut of that gel, that leaf, the cutaway, you have the gel inside. You obviously have the outside that's not usable for human health. There's a very thin, you can see it almost in that picture. It's kind of yellowish. That's the latex material that typically you don't want to consume, that will cause you to have diarrhea or upset stomach. But The beauty of this plant is obviously in the middle of that gel. Of course, it's 98.5, 99% water. So you have to extract all of that water out. And a lot of times when I start talking about allopolysaccharides, one of the things that people will think to themselves is, oh, well, he's talking about aloe vera. I can just drink the juice or the gel and I can get the same benefit. No, you cannot, because again, you'd never drink enough of that gel to get enough of the polysaccharide content to have a therapeutic benefit. So it would literally be impossible to drink enough gel to get enough polysaccharide content in the context that I'm going to present to you guys tonight. And then the rice bran, just very quickly, it's about, I think, 70 to 80% of the rice that's sold in the world to eat is white rice. So the white rice is the large endosperm that's left once rice is taken into the field or from the field into the mill to be processed. You have the husk or the hull that's on the outside that we don't eat. That gets pulled off and thrown away. Then the next layer below that is the bran. And that's really where the main benefit or value of this plant is. But unfortunately, again, most of the world prefers to eat white rice. So the bran ends up either being thrown away or fed to livestock. I mean, it's like the best thing that this plant provides to us for human health is thrown away or fed to animals. So it's really incredible that you have all of these polysaccharides, amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals, elements, cofactors, metabolites, all this rich nutritional value, but yet it gets thrown away or fed to animals. And so we're not able to take advantage of that. But fortunately, there were some people that were able to look beyond just thinking of it as a waste or a byproduct of milling and figured out that it could be very beneficial to people. So we were able to run, going back, again, quite a few years now. It's hard to believe this has been this many years ago, but we had the funding through the generosity of one family member or one family who had lost four family members to Alzheimer's disease, and they were listening to Dr. McDaniel talk at a seminar one time, and he was presenting some anecdotal data about some of the patients he was working with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and having just really phenomenal responses to these allopolysaccharides. And so this family decided to make a donation, and Dr. McDaniel and I had met, sometime a couple of years before this. And so he was not affiliated with an academic institution. None of his friends or colleagues who were affiliated with any academic institution had any interest in nutrition. And so it was just me being in the right place at the right time and him turning to me and saying, hey, John, we've got a gift from a family that we can use for research, but we have to run the trial in Alzheimer's disease. Would you like to be involved? Would you like to be the principal investigator and do this? And so it was just a wonderful opportunity for me. We were able to piggyback on with that funding to do the study with multiple sclerosis patients as well. But as I mentioned, I'm so proud of this work, and ultimately it changed my life. So just very quickly, again, emphasizing, and this is actually an excellent paper that was just published this past year. And by the way, I didn't mention it before, but if anyone is interested in either the presentation, any of the articles that I'm mentioning tonight, I'm more than happy to share those with you. I know Dr. Clearfield has my email address, and for anyone who does not, if you didn't get my email before, please, by all means, ask Dr. Clearfield, and I'd be happy to share this information with anyone. So don't worry about missing out on this. If you didn't catch my email, I'm more than happy to share this. But the allopolysaccharides, there are several different synonyms you may hear for it: acetylated polymannose, ace-mannan. These all basically mean the same thing. So these polysaccharides are incredibly dense, complex materials. I mean, they are literally hundreds of glucose units attached together with these glycosidic bonds. And excuse me, the polysaccharides in general have been shown to be more complex in information than even amino acids and fatty acids. So that just gives you some idea of the complexity of these particular compounds and molecules. And I would argue, putting up anything that you can think of. And again, I'm talking about the aloe now. If we have time, I'll talk about the rice bran later. And then, anything else you can think of. I mean, obviously, curcumin, for example, has been well studied, thousands of papers behind its looking into all of its different effects. But I would put these allopolysaccharides up against just about anything else that Mother Nature provides for us in terms of all of its healing benefits. And that's why I'm saying this paper by Bai and colleagues from last year is a great review paper summarizing all of these different mechanisms of actions that they have summarized from investigators around the world. I don't think they quoted us too much, which is okay. I wasn't personally insulted by that. But nonetheless, if you look at just, some of these bullet points here, aloe vera just has, these polysaccharides from aloe vera just have really incredible and dynamic healing effects that are so important for all of us, not just if you have a health challenge, but to actually help prevent that in the first place. And so, one of the things that's nice to just very generically or at a very high level sort of, explain about this process is why is it that these polysaccharides are so amazing and so dynamic? And so if you look at how every time the cell does something, whether it's communicating with another cell, creating a glycolipid, creating a glycoprotein, some other bioactive compound on its way to creating either a cytokine or a growth factor, something like that. Every time that process occurs, we need certain amounts of these polysaccharides when the endoplasmic reticulum is talking to the Golgi. So this is just like very fundamental bioengineering 101. It's just like, after oxygen being our first nutrient and then vitamins and minerals and all these other things that our cells need to function properly, these polysaccharides are so crucial to that entire process. So one of the things that we've discovered along the way of, our research program and all the work that we've put into this is how many different effects we've been able to document and publish on the immune system. And so it really seems like to us that one of the most significant things that, excuse me, these allopolysaccharides do for us is they actually function like a signaling mechanism for the immune system, much the way the polysaccharides in the rice bran does. So one of the things that, again, Dr. McDaniel, up until the point of us having the funding to do the study on Alzheimer's or the two studies on Alzheimer's and MS, most of the work that he had done up to that point, again, due to, not having funding, which is, I'm sure many of you know, getting funding for nutrition is a whole different ball game or story compared to being funded by big pharma to look at different chemicals or synthetic things. But anyway, one of his most, I would say, significant parts of his work in all of this in the last 40 years, and by the way, for him, this all started back in the mid to late 1980s. So this is just a reflection of how many years he's been at this. But he was working with a group of cancer patients at a hospice center in the Dallas area. And again, this was part of my introduction to how these polysaccharides were so effective. And oh, by the way, I didn't mention that in my training, I think in biochemistry, I may have had one lecture about the benefits of polysaccharides or saccharides in general as a fuel source for the cells. And that was it. I mean, I literally knew nothing else about all of these other dynamic effects that polysaccharides from certain key sources could have. But anyway, Dr. Reg was working with this group at this hospice center, which, as we all know, hospice is typically your last step before the funeral home. So it's not exactly like, a charming or lovely place to work. But this particular patient, this man had metastatic disease originating from the pancreas, and then it had spread into his liver and several other places. But he had already had surgery, radiation, chemotherapy, the entire 9 yards of conventional treatment, and still got sent to hospice to die. And so Dr. Reg came in there, got any person who was willing at that point to give the polysaccharides a try. I mean, you got to figure, well, what the heck, there's not a lot left to discover here. And so you might as well give it a shot. So I hope everybody can see from this presentation, and if not, you can get it later and then really be able to see very well how big on the left from July of 1999, and it's obviously going back quite a few years, you can see how big that tumor was. And then on the right, July of 2000, a year later, you can see how much smaller that tumor was after taking the saccharides. And then ultimately, this man ended up leaving hospice cancer-free. So again, I'm not making any claims about nutrition treating disease. This is allowing the body to utilize raw materials that it recognizes are important for basically restoring homeostasis and engaging or enabling the bioengineering of life to heal itself. Obviously, we all know this is a far different paradigm from using drugs or surgery or anything else to treat disease. So again, for me, this was very powerful, and learning about all this work that he had done up to this point was just highly motivational for me to want to get involved in this, learn more, and then understand what our potential was for using this material. But here are a couple of background statistics on the Alzheimer's situation and how terrible it is today. I mean, it's really incredible. I think now there are something like between 6 and 7 million Americans with Alzheimer's. I'm willing to bet most of you listening, if you've not had a family member, you've got patients, or people in your sphere that have had either Alzheimer's or some other form of dementia. But so you've got 6 to 7 million Americans with Alzheimer's, another 8 to 9 million Americans with some form of dementia. So by percentage, out of whatever we have today, 330 million people, it's really not a huge number from a percentage perspective. But when you look at the amount of money that it's costing to take care of these people, both from the direct side and the indirect side, it's somewhere between 500 billion to $1 trillion. And then, of course, you've got the impact of what happens to the caregiver. The caregiver of people, or the caregiver of Alzheimer's patients, actually suffers worse than the caregiver of any other type of disease or disorder, be it HIV, cancer, heart disease. So you not only have the person suffering and being crippled with this terrible disease, but you've got the primary caregiver suffering from taking care of that person with the disease. You've got all these associated costs. It's the 6th leading killer of Americans. It's the #1 killer in the UK. Just on and on and on. The 5 FDA-approved drugs for dementia. You're lucky if they will delay decline for a few months, but you eventually just continue falling off the cliff. This new drug that was provisionally approved last year, I don't know if it's now fully approved. I think it's like a $60,000 or $70,000 a year treatment. It's an IV. It's got all sorts of side effects related to stroke and kidney issues. I mean, in my opinion, it's not really exactly the most friendly way to look at treating people with this disease. But here's the header from our first study. So what we chose to do was put people on this. We called it generically an allopolymannose multinutrient complex. We decided to study these people for 12 months. We chose people with moderate to severe severity of Alzheimer's. We were not interested in either mild cognitive impairment or mild dementia, because we know that those are the people that Big Pharma has the most interest in. And the people that are at moderate to severe severity, those are the people that Big Pharma, quite frankly, looks at as a lost cause, basically. And so Dr. Reg and I were very motivated to try to run a study where we could actually offer those people, the people that are most impaired, some opportunity to benefit from this. And this was, again, based on the impressive results that he was getting anecdotally. So we felt very comfortable and very confident that we would show something. We just didn't have any idea how effective this would be. You can see here that we were giving people 2.5 grams of the formula 4 times per day. We chose to use a powder in the study because we know that it's 25, 30, maybe even 35% of people with Alzheimer's, as you probably know, have issues with swallowing. So we felt like a powder was a better formulation compared to, say, a capsule or a tablet. We had sufficient funding to look at the neuropsych testing from baseline, 3, 6, 9, and 12 months follow-up. Unfortunately, our budget was not big enough to do the blood work more than at baseline in 12 months. So we have a gap in what happened in the blood at 3, 6, and 9 months, but nonetheless, we do have the capacity, as you'll see here in just a moment, to look at what happened over that 12-month intervention or over the course of those 12 months in terms of the cellular or the physiological effect. So again, this is the first paper we published. Gosh, that's hard to believe. That was all the way back in 2013. So much water has traveled under the bridge since then. But anyway, here's the graph that just, again, folks, I mean, I can't emphasize this enough. It just completely changed my life. This score, now you may, if you're not familiar with ADAS-Cog or you haven't heard me lecture about this before, you might think a score going down is bad. But in this case, actually, the ADAS-Cog, if you are at a 70, you're like a piece of furniture. That's the highest you can score on the ADAS-Cog. You're literally completely, you're literally brain dead. If you score a 0, you have perfect cognitive function. So this is a measure where you want to see a score going down to indicate improvement. So you can see over the course of the 12 months, we actually had a little bit of a worsening effect from baseline to 3 months, which, you might argue that's just random data, that because statistically it didn't mean anything. But you see the asterisks above the 9 and the 12-month portions of this graph. So we showed not just statistically significant, but clinically significant improvement. And I want you guys to please listen to what I just said. Clinically and statistically significant improvement in cognitive function in people with moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease. And oh, by the way, I didn't mention they were 79.9 years of age on average. The ADAS-Cog is widely considered to be the gold standard of cognitive functioning. I'm sorry, of assessing cognitive function. That's not my opinion. That's pretty well established in the literature. It's been referenced in literally thousands of articles. It's been around, I think, since the 70s or 80s. So it's a very old assessment, very widely used. We had the same neuropsychologist doing this assessment throughout the entire study. She saw every patient. She did every test. So the inter-rater error, you would say, is 0, because there was no difference in, her and maybe 2 or 3 other people doing the assessment. So we felt just, literally it blew us away. This was the kind of moment in your life where you see data like this and you want to have a party or something. It's just that kind of a moment as a scientist, as somebody that's, looking for something that can help people. And so this very much confirmed, like, I was getting phone calls from caregivers as the study was running, and, even staff members. I was having people call me up and say, hey, I can't believe what, so-and-so is now doing, these kinds of anecdotal comments. And of course, again, it's building this anticipation, building this excitement. You don't know what's going to happen till you actually run the statistics and actually see what you've discovered or what's there. But yeah, this graph here for me, guys, was just so powerful and so rewarding to see what we had showed in this study. And so here, how do you explain the clinical or practical result? What, mechanistically speaking, what is going on inside the cells or at the physiological level to support what was happening at the clinical level? Well, you can see here, this first line, you have the CD4 to CD8 ratio. We show a nice statistically significant improvement there. Now, of course, as you all well know, the CD4 to CD8 ratio is not just important for people with Alzheimer's disease, that's important for all of us. So we want that ratio of our helper to cytotoxic cells to be relatively high, and especially as we age, that's a very nice thing to show that we had this improvement in global immune function. TNF alpha and VEGF, those proteins are commonly looked at, most historically have been looked at in heart disease and cancer. Our paper is probably the first paper showing this nice reduction in both of those 2 inflammatory markers in this particular population. I don't think that had ever been published before, just like our cognitive function findings. And then, boy, look at this last row, the CD14s, a marker of adult stem cells. They improved by just under 300% from baseline to 12 months. So all of these cellular physiological changes were just incredible to us. For us, it was a really nice picture, if you will, to look at, in lieu of the fact that we didn't have, anything in the budget, and going back 15 or so years ago, I don't even know how sophisticated the technology was, like a CT scan or something like that, to actually look at brain morphology. But, and obviously that technology has improved since that period of time. But in lieu of not being able to actually look at the brain itself, what does this picture tell us? Well, for us, you have this clinical change, this very significant clinical change on the cognitive side, supported by the fact that you have an overall improvement in immune function, you're lowering inflammation, and then you're turning on the adult stem cell process. So we know that CD14 cells can actually become neurons too. That's not through our lab, that's through work at other laboratories. But it just made perfect sense to us that if you can improve immune function, turn on that adult stem cell production process at the same time, toning down or tampering down that inflammation, now you can have a dynamic effect on cognitive function. And this linking the, brain health, which is sort of a proxy measure of central nervous system function or brain function, with all of this going on the immune system side, was just really impressive for us. And again, was beyond our expectation. Let's put it that way. We were really blown away with the results that we received. Now, as we were publishing that first paper and, looking at this massive, rich set of data that we had and wondering what else that we could find that was sort of not necessarily hiding, but, that hadn't been explored or hadn't been analyzed in the first paper. And so as brain-derived neurotropic factors started getting a bit more attention during that period of time in the next year or two, and started looking, other people were looking into how that plays a role in terms of, your preservation of memories, your your function of your hippocampus, general neuroplasticity, all these different factors. We thought, well, we still have all of this information sitting there. We didn't look at BDNF at all in the first paper, but we ended up getting 2 additional papers with looking at how BDNF compared in one paper with cognitive function on the cognitive side, and then in the other paper on the immune side. So, we end up running those analyses. It's important to point out that the change in BDNF, unfortunately, was not statistically significant over that 12-month period. It did increase by about 11 percentage points, again, not statistically significant. And then the pro-BDNF really didn't change at all. In fact, it went down just a little bit. But again, it really wasn't for us, as exciting to see this kind of a change. Although what we ended up doing, and I'll show you that with this next slide, is that we had conducted a study previously where we were looking at BDNF and its relationship in a group of people with HIV, and they'd been taking antiretroviral medications. So in that field or in that branch of literature, there was this idea that people with HIV taking antiretroviral medications had this cognitive dysfunction associated with the combination or the negative effects of the medication combined with the virus itself. And so we had looked at BDNF at a threshold point where we found that this marker of 5,000 picograms, people with HIV on antiretroviral medication actually had better cognitive function if they were at 5,000 picograms or higher. So given that we didn't have a statistically significant change in BDNF across our intervention, we decided, okay, well, let's split the sample in 2 and let's see if we can find anything that's, similar to what we showed in our previous work with HIV patients. And so sure enough, when you look at all these different things, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through them one by one, but generally speaking here, the higher level of BDNF was related to better cognitive function. So that was very consistent with our previous research in HIV. So that was what we had focused on in this particular paper. Now, as science has it, sometimes things are very consistent and you can begin to paint a very clear picture of things. Other times they're not necessarily so consistent. So in this case, related to immune function and inflammation, again, splitting the sample in 2 between those at 5,000 picograms or greater versus those under 5,000, you can look at some of these different markers here and see, well, wait a minute, it's kind of confusing. So for example, like, even though we showed the benefit of the CD14 cells in the first paper, in this particular paper, we're actually showing that the percentage of CD14 cells is actually higher in people with less BDNF than it is in people with higher BDNF. So again, those are just, dynamic complexities that are sometimes very challenging to explain. Again, I didn't find this paper as quite as meaningful as the paper that we published looking at BDNF with cognitive function, but nonetheless, that's, part of our journey and part of our story of what we've found to date. And so this is the 4th paper that we've published from this study. And I feel like, especially for those of you who have heard this talk before, this is something that you haven't heard, because again, this was published right at the end of last year. And I had an idea for a while, again, even though academic publishing is probably not even in my top 10 list of priorities at the moment. But nonetheless, I was thinking of, okay, I know there's something else in this data set that I've missed. And as we were writing, we published a couple of review papers over the last couple of years too, one on cognitive function and nutrition and another one on immune function and nutrition. And in the latter one, I had read a few papers along the way about the relationship between Th1 and Th2 in the immune system and some of the different components of the immune system and how they were affected by, I think in that case, it was by vitamin D, something unrelated to our work. But nonetheless, the idea of looking at the Th1 to Th2 ratio was very fascinating. And so I thought about it, and then I was looking at what some other people had published and how they had calculated the Th1 to Th2 ratio, which cytokines and growth factors they had looked at, and then, okay, well, we've got the same type of data in our data set. And so I don't know about you guys, for those of you who do publish, but one of the first things that I do when I'm getting ready to write a new paper is I go to PubMed and then I do a lit search and see what else has been published on my particular idea. That way I can gain an idea of how much I can either focus on one aspect or another of a certain topic or a certain idea. So I kid you not, after a couple of hours of searching and searching and searching on PubMed, I could not find one other paper that showed anything related to the Th1 to Th2 ratio or story about within Alzheimer's disease. And I thought, wow, this is really incredible. Like there's literally nothing else that talks about this issue. And so I ended up making the calculations. We had another study of healthy people that had the exact same cytokine and growth factor profile. So we had all the same biomarkers in both data sets. When I calculated the ratios and then looked at the difference between the two studies, the data were just completely remarkable. The people with Alzheimer's disease were so Th1 dominant. Their scores were so high. And then the people from the healthy study, no diabetes, no cancer, no heart disease, no infectious disease, certainly no neurodegeneration, again, otherwise thought of as being healthy. All of their values were very close to or near 1. And I'll show those in just a second. But you can see the different ratios here that we're talking about in this paper. But it turned out to be a really nice effort to create unique, and as far as our knowledge is concerned, completely new and novel to the scientific literature. So just take a look at these values for a second. Again, look how dominant, Th1 dominant the Alzheimer's patients are, and then look at the healthy adults. You can see their 6 scores and how low they are. And then, of course, all these were just wildly statistically significantly different. So that was just really fascinating to look into this and begin to understand, just one more little piece of the puzzle of this Alzheimer's story. So that was the first slide. The second slide is, now this is looking at the change in these ratios over that 12-month period. So you have baseline first and then 12 months second. Now, only 2 of these statistically changed, but you can see that 5 of the 6 are actually going back toward, let's call it, less Th1 dominance. I mean, they're certainly not getting, other than the interferon gamma to TNF alpha ratio, it's getting down to 6.8 on average, but certainly none of these are even remotely close to getting toward unity, but at least in terms of where they were at baseline to where they were at 12 months, 5 of the 6 of them are going back toward, again, let's just call it less Th1 dominance, because there's no other better way really to say it, in my opinion. And then the cherry on top of the cake, or the icing on the cake, pardon the sugary pun, is that this rebalancing, if you will, of the Th1 to Th2 ratios was correlated with improved cognitive function. So for me, in our opinion, my co-authors and I, we really were like, okay, this is the best part of this study, because obviously, it's one thing to be able to show something, on the cellular or the physiological level, but when you can actually apply this clinically and practically, and it has a meaning for, someone's life, that's where your rubber, in my opinion, your rubber really hits the road. So this was just, again, a beautiful paper that we're so proud of. So all these things that that have occurred for us, and all these things that we've published. And again, I'm happy to share all 4 of these papers with you guys if you want them. But basically, all these things are completely unique discoveries. And I would actually ask any of you. I used to say I challenge people. I don't challenge. Maybe that's too argumentative or too narcissistic. But I would ask anybody if you can show me another paper. I don't care if it's one of the 5 FDA approved drugs for dementia, a diet, another dietary supplement, exercise training, hyperbaric oxygen, acupuncture, music therapy. I don't care what the intervention is. Show me something else that showed clinically and statistically significant improvements in cognitive function over a 1-year period in people with moderate to severe Alzheimer's disease. I just haven't seen it. I've never even heard of such a thing. And so that's why I'm still out here, talking about this message from a paper that's published 11 years ago. But I think the significance of it is so important, and it still is, again, a lot of what I'm basing my work on today. And so I want to always, respect that first paper for what it did for me in my life. And again, being able to help people. I mean, it's one thing to be a good scientist and, do ethical work and not be a scumbag and, try to rip people off or do dirty science and fabricate your data and all these other things that you hear people occasionally do. But it's a whole different level when you actually are a very good ethical scientist that you can then help people, because obviously there are lots of things that, basic scientists, with all due respect to them, they're looking at cells or tissues or even animals, and, they're trying to translate that information to what that means for human health. And unfortunately, a lot of times that work never translates, even getting all the way to the animal level. It never then ultimately translates into what it means for human beings. But when you can actually do this kind of work and then see it actually happen immediately, it's just very, very powerful. And I mean, I had so many people, calling me in tears of joy about what their loved one was doing for the first time, in some cases in years. For me, that was just, again, very rewarding. And I really haven't done anything else in my scientific career to match all of this work so far. And again, we're talking about multiple years of my life here that's actually still going. And so I'll jump now to the 2 papers that we've published from the MS study. We actually have a 3rd paper that was submitted as a sister paper to the 4th paper from the Alzheimer's study. And I actually just got the review back from the journal yesterday. The reviews were very fair, not unreasonable, and I should be able to respond to all those in the next few weeks. So we'll have actually a 3rd paper from the MS study that I could come back another time and present to you guys. But here are the first 2 papers that we ran with people with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, which obviously is, as I'm sure you guys know, these kinds of patients are not as severely impacted on the cognitive level as people with Alzheimer's. Their impact is more on the functional level. And then, of course, they're subjected to being at risk of all these different infections. But we had a very similar panel of biomarkers that we looked at, but obviously the cognitive function and the quality of life markers were quite a bit different. But one thing that I learned along the way in running this trial was that people with MS don't actually die of neurodegeneration. Typically, they die of infection. So whether it's a lung infection, some other sort of, major organ system infection like UTI, whatever the case may be, that's ultimately what kills people for the most part with MS. It's not the actual neurodegeneration. So when we looked at the change in infection from baseline to 12 months, you can see these numbers here. I mean, just again, wildly statistically better. We went from about a number of 8 infections, if you can believe that, so many different infections these patients had, 8 infections on average at baseline, down to 2.5 at 12 months. So again, we're talking about being able to knock down the leading cause of mortality in this population, but also even more than that, being able to help this overburdened medical system that we have, where you have people constantly shuffling in and out of urgent care or hospitals or other facilities and dealing with these infections that's very expensive to treat. And so being able to improve quality of life, simultaneously helping to relieve some of the burden on the healthcare system or the medical system, was very significant. Also in that particular paper, again, we looked at all these different inflammation and immune function markers. I think the most significant one to me, well, actually 2, epidermal growth factor. You guys may be aware of this particular protein being related to remyelination. So that's very important for people with MS, highly, highly significant, and very nice finding there. And then the CD95 to CD34, the FAST gene, the FAS gene, the FAST gene, that's another global marker of immune function. And you can see how nicely that went up as well over that 12-month period. So again, very nice findings on the inflammatory and immune function side. Now the FAMS, as I mentioned from the Alzheimer's study, the ADAS-Cog is widely considered to be the gold standard, of cognitive assessment in people with dementia for cognitive function. The FAMS is also considered to be the gold standard for functional assessment for people with multiple sclerosis. So I'm sorry if these numbers are a little bit small. I'm trying to squeeze a lot of information here on this slide, but you can see all of the different subscales were statistically significant other than emotional well-being and family social well-being, but everything else was statistically significant. You can see a little bit of a peaking going on at the 9th-month assessment. I'm not sure why that happened, but we tended to have in some of these quality of life measures a bit of a plateauing at 9 months and then a little bit of a tailing off at 12, but nonetheless, overall, the models were still statistically significant in terms of looking at how the functional assessment improved over that period of time. The EQ5D3L, say that very rapidly 6 times in a row, I can't. This is a global quality of life measure, again, very, very well validated, referenced in a lot of different publications. Again, very nice statistically significant improvements there over that with the 2 different parts of that measure. The BDI, that's the Beck Depression Inventory, that's looking at depressive symptoms. That was a very nice change over the 12-month period. And then this HCDS, that was a homemade scale that we used in this neurology clinic that focused on MS patients. That also improved very dramatically over the course of the 12-month period. Dr. Clearfield, how are we doing on time? Because it's 9 o'clock and I don't want to be an ogre.
I think we're doing okay.
How much longer do you want me to go?
You can go up to 10, or you can eat buffet.
Agree.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Sometimes we go over a half hour to an hour.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, I'm sorry if I took up so much time during that. I want to.
You're good.
Because I do want to give the rice bran portion of this a little bit of time. So I want to skip over. Let me just jump through. And again, you guys are more than welcome to have these slides.
You're good, John. Just do your thing.
Okay. Well, there were just a couple of other studies there that didn't come from our lab, but they were basically looking at other polysaccharide formulas and their effect on cognitive function and brain health. Quite frankly, they weren't as exciting as our research because they were done in either college students or healthy adults. And I mean, I have them in there just to represent that other labs around the country have been looking at cognition and its effect or impact based on the allopolysaccharides. But nonetheless, I want to skip over that because, again, I want to get into the rice bran for just a little bit. But here's kind of the summary or the conclusion that I've drawn over this nearly 20-year period of my life and learning about allopolysaccharides and again, the work that we've primarily conducted in our lab. I think, one of the takeaways, again, is that you have an incredible opportunity to help people with very significant illness. Again, not talking about treating disease with nutrition, but basically using nutrition as a supportive measure to enable the cells to function properly and then to help the body restore itself back to some level of balance or homeostasis. So however that occurs is, again, a very complex method within our inherent intelligence, but nonetheless, to be able to publish these findings has been so rewarding for me, and to be able to help people with these terrible diseases improve some level of their quality of life is just really, really significant. I would also tell you guys that, to our knowledge, and this is now speaking as myself and Dr. McDaniel, our 60+ years combined together of being in this area, and even many of his colleagues, that would put us well over a few hundred years of combined experience. We don't know of any medication, be it a prescription or an over-the-counter, where you may have a risk of having some sort of an adverse effect with taking the allopolysaccharides. We've never even heard of it. And so there's no issue. You know, sometimes people are cautious. In fact, I had my wife taking this formula when she was pregnant, had no issues with we started introducing solid foods into her diet. I started giving her the formula when she was 6 months. This child has a brain like you can't believe, just incredibly healthy and just very, very amazing development so far in her short life, all the way to my mother. I mean, she's been on this formula for 15 years. I've been on it myself for well over a decade. So I say all that to say that, you know, again, for me, this isn't just about, well, you've got some issue, now how do you deal with it? This is about preventing stuff from happening to you in the first place. And so I will argue about the polysaccharides, much like I will the rice bran polysaccharides, that I don't care if you're vegan or carnivore or keto or paleo, your dietary philosophy or preference to me is not really a concern in this, because you don't get these things from food. And so it's important to of these polysaccharides, because again, and even eating brown rice every day. I mean, again, I've already mentioned this a little bit before, but I don't think you could eat enough brown rice every day to really have enough of the rice bran content to make a therapeutic difference in your health status. So again, I mentioned some of this about rice bran a little bit before, but some of these articles that I've referenced here at the bottom of this slide, basically in general, rice bran is just an incredibly dynamic material, much like the allopolysaccharides are. And so here are some of the other functions and benefits that rice bran has been shown to have by other investigators around the world. Now, we were using this particular rice bran, this hydrolyzed rice bran, and we ran 3 clinical trials. We had a healthy group of people that we ran one study, the first study with. Then we looked at a group of people with HIV, and then we looked at a group of people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. So these studies have come to a conclusion. I've tried looking at some other different possibilities within our data sets, like I did with the Alzheimer's study and the Th1 and Th2 ratios. Unfortunately, I didn't really find much exciting there, so I've kind of left these data sets behind. But nonetheless, I know that, again, if money was no object, I could have so many different clinical trials running, with these materials showing the benefits of these things. So you have rice bran itself, just, again, the material that is milled off of the rice kernel. And so you have this material that, then gets stabilized for what rice bran ultimately actually is used by human beings. Well, actually, I guess for animal feed too, you want that to be stabilized because of the fatty acid content in it. It can get rancid if it's not stabilized properly in the processing of the material. But when it's hydrolyzed with the shiitake mushroom enzyme, and this again is a bit theoretical, but what we think is happening is that it actually lowers the molecular weight, which turns it into something a little bit different. So it goes from, one source of material of a signaling mechanism for the immune system, much like the allopolysaccharides. And here's, one theory that some colleagues have had about this, and this is obviously very specific toward cancer, this Salil Lewis X and Salil Lewis A, whoever that Lewis is. I don't think I'm related to him, but this expression is markedly enhanced in cancer cells. And so there is something about this particular material, this rice bran material, that it seems to have a very significant and specific ability to recognize these particular determinants. And so again, this is a bit of a working theory, and this is not just based on the research from our own lab. This is actually based on a lot of the work that's been done in Japan and other parts of Asia where this all originated from. But it is very exciting to consider what the potential is of this material, especially even in combination with the allopolysaccharide, which is part of where I'm going in my own career. But in this first study with healthy people, it was a 60-day trial. So, pretty short. I mean, not anything near like the 12-month trials we ran in the other studies. But we looked at a very big battery of different biomarkers, the cytokines, the growth factors, liver function, kidney function. We looked at a lot of different biomarkers to really, this first study was really to mostly verify or confirm a lot of data from overseas that showed this material is very safe. And of course, it's on the GRAS list. I mean, it's not anything that exotic. But in addition to the safety data, we also wanted to look at, again, the NK cells, the natural killer cell cytotoxicity and count, and then also the cytokines and growth factors. So what we showed from this first study, the natural killer cell cytotoxicity, and just as a reminder, of course, our natural killer cells are our first line of defense against virally infected cells and also against dying, transforming, mutating cells. So we really want our natural killer cells to be peak and optimal and able to recognize these other cells that shouldn't be, to help knock them out and eliminate them before they cause us any problems. So you can see over the course of this 60-day period, we've got a very nice peak at 1 week. Now, remember, these are healthy people. So no diabetes, no cancer, heart disease, no depression, certainly no neurodegeneration, nothing of the sort. Healthy people, you give them this material, the hydrolyzed rice bran. At 1 week, the natural killer cell cytotoxicity peaks, and then it goes back down over the 30 and 60 days to actually even a little bit below baseline. It turns out that the two groups, one group was given 1 gram per day, the other group in red was given 3 grams per day. There were no statistically significant differences between those two groups. So you could essentially draw that as one line. And the assessment point at 1 week was statistically higher than all of the other 4 time points. So for us, we interpreted this basically as exactly true immunomodulation, in the sense that the rice bran was given to the subjects, the natural killer cells were turned on. These were in healthy people. There was nothing going on. There was no virus, no bacteria, no other cause for concern. And the immune system said, okay, guys, you don't need to do anything. We're shutting you off. I mean, for us, this was just like perfect, true immunomodulation. We could not have drawn this graph any more beautiful than it turned out to be. So we were really pleased and really excited with that result. Out of the, I think it was 12 or 14 cytokines and growth factors that we looked at, again, over this 60-day period, from baseline 30 and 60 days, you can see these 4 in particular. I think there were a couple of others that were also statistically significant, but I'm just highlighting these 4 for you in this first study. You can see TNF alpha going down, IL-6 going down, both of those, again, very significant inflammatory markers, as you well know. MCP1 actually going up. So that was a nice, interesting finding, in the sense that it actually, much like the natural killer cell finding, you want your MCP1 to be at some level, so that way you have the ability for the immune system to recognize where you may have a start of a cancer process. So this was a very nice finding as well. And then, of course, knocking down VEGF a little bit, again, as I mentioned from the Alzheimer's study, that's very important for your cardiovascular disease and cancer risk. So overall, very nice findings in that study as far as liver and kidney, those outcome measures. Nothing was out of the norm. Everything was pretty much within normal limits. Nothing one way or the other showing that anything was problematic with hydrolyzed rice bran. The second study we ran, this is the one with the non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. I really, much like some of the things that I was learning as I was running the other trials, I really had no clue, and I'm guessing a lot of you know this better than me, but how significant liver disease has become, not just in the United States, but across the world, and not just for people that have an alcohol problem. I mean, it's really remarkable how difficult this disease is to treat. Most of the research, and this has now been a couple of years ago, so I may not be as intimately aware of the literature as I was a few years ago, but as we were running this study and then writing this paper, basically for anybody with NAFLD or NASH, you're told to lose weight, because the theory is that, you lose overall body weight, body fat, you will also lose fat in the liver as well. But again, from a conventional medical perspective, somebody that has NAFLD really doesn't have, from that perspective, really doesn't have many options. So based on some previous work that had been done with a rat model of liver disease that turned out to be pretty exciting, we were able to run this study in people with NAFLD. So we had two groups here, one group taking 1 gram per day of the rice bran, and then the other group on a placebo. And then again, this is a relatively short-term study. It's only over a 90-day period, but we had the 3 different time points. So here's ALP. You can see the rice bran group in blue, the placebo group in red. You can see that the rice bran is knocking down ALP, whereas in the placebo group, this is going up. And of course, again, just please keep in mind, this is over a 90-day period. So these are relatively short-term data that you have to take that into context. Eosinophils, you see their percentage going up over the 90-day period in the rice bran group, whereas they're going down in the placebo guys. Monocytes, you see their percentage going up again in the rice bran group. They actually go up as well in the placebo group, but it was not statistically significant in the placebo group, only in the rice bran group. Then you have your neutrophils and your IL-17, which your neutrophils actually secrete IL-17. So this was a nice consistent finding showing that as the neutrophil percentage went down over the 90-day period, it also resulted in a lowering of IL-17 as well, which obviously IL-17 is important, being that it's part of the Th17 component of our immune system that's typically pro-inflammatory. And it's been shown that this particular cytokine is very important for looking at how the liver can become fibrotic over time if this condition is not dealt with in the early stages. GGT, gamma glutamyl transferase, this was a very nice finding, although it did not reach statistical significance. But this is one of these cases where you could argue that actually the clinical relevance was even more important than whatever you would show statistically anyway. And I would argue that we didn't show statistical significance just because we have a fairly small number of subjects in this study. But clinically, you want to get GGT below 50, and that's international units per liter. So you can see in the rice bran group, it goes down over that 90-day period, down below that level of 50, which is clinically meaningful. So this is where if your level stays above 50, you're in danger of going from NAFLD to some form of liver disease. So this was a very, very nice finding for us. And you can see in the red, in the placebo group, their value continues going up over that 90-day period. So that was arguably one of the nicest findings that we had in this study. And then IL-18, this was another cytokine that the investigators from the rat study had looked at. And it's mostly showing the same thing that was shown in the rat study, although we do have from the 45 to the 90-day period, you can see a bit of an uptake in the score, although from baseline to 90 days, it's going down. And then, of course, the exact opposite thing is happening in the placebo group where it's peaking at 45 days. Again, these are anomalous values that are difficult to explain and difficult to put into context. But nonetheless, this overall decrease in IL-18 was consistent with the previous research that had been conducted in those animal studies. And again, very safe, no adverse effects, and really nice overall findings. In fact, the results from that study, from the NAFLD study, and then combined with this study, the HIV study, these, much like what we showed with the allopolysaccharides and Alzheimer's and MS are very unique and novel findings in the literature that you won't find anything else like that, whether you're talking about, again, diet or a medication or some other form of some other type of dietary supplement. So again, very, very exciting findings that we've been able to conduct over this period of these last 15 years or so. So this last study that was out of our lab, this is again with people that were on HIV, that have HIV, that were on stable antiretroviral therapy. So one of the things that happens to people, I'm sure if you've got people that are HIV positive in your practice, you know that over time, as they take these antiretroviral medications, their CD4 to CD8 ratio gets inverted. And when that happens, when that ratio goes below 1.0, they become at greater risk of having diabetes, cancer, heart disease, all the other typical things that all the rest of us are at risk for if we don't take care of ourselves. And so what ends up happening is, and I don't know if any of you do this in your practice, but if you try to manipulate the antiretroviral medication regimen, about 80% of the time it fails to get that inverted CD4 to CD8 ratio back over 1.0. So over the 6-month period of our intervention, you can see here again, the folks in blue are on rice bran, the folks in red are the placebo. For CD4 cells, there were basically no differences. You can see that for the most part over that 6-month period, there was no change in both groups. Where the change really occurred, though, was in the CD8 or the cytotoxic cells. You can see that there was a very significant increase in the placebo group, just under a 60% increase, whereas we were able to knock down that cytotoxic level, that CD8 cytotoxic level, down by just a little bit over 5%, which again doesn't sound like a lot statistically, but clinically it turned out to be very significant, because this statistical change, or this significant difference, turned into this, which is showing that you can see both groups at baseline, both the rice bran group and the placebo group, were under this 1.0 value that I mentioned at baseline. And then look what happened over the course of the 6 months. You've got the BioBrand group going up over 1.0, whereas the placebo group continues going down. So again, this fell just short of statistical significance, but when you're talking about the clinical relevance of this threshold of 1.0 that's so significant, for us, this was just such an exciting finding. And again, I would argue that we would have had statistical significance had we had a little bit bigger sample size, but nonetheless, just a really beautiful finding, showing how we could get this ratio back above 1.0 that 80% of the time medications don't do. And again, it's been a couple of years since I've looked into this literature significantly, but I'm not aware of any other nutritional, dietary supplement, herbal, botanical, homeopathy, whatever you want to call it, anything else out there that's been able to do this over a 6-month period. So my colleagues and I are all very proud of this work. Again, this is just a snapshot of our work, but there have been, as you can see on this slide, lots of other people looking at this rice bran around the world. Most of these folks are in Asia. Some of them are in Europe. But for the most part, most of this work is being done in Asia, and a little to a less degree here in the United States. Again, I'm going to check our time here. It's 9:20. If I've bored you to death about polysaccharides at this point,
I thought that was great, John.
well,
Yeah, we're still good. Go ahead, keep going.
okay, well,
Unless you've had enough.
well, yeah, it's been a pretty intense day for me. I don't know about you guys. It's 9:20 for me. So for those of us on the East Coast, it's been a pretty long day for me. But anyway, I'll just go over this slide here, or this study here, because I think it is very, very nice. Controlled trial, again, using this BioBrand product, this hydrolyzed patients, and they were randomized to either receive the standard interventional therapy or the standard therapy plus the hydrolyzed rice bran. And I find this study to be very well done. The results speak for themselves, but just look at some of these data here. So when you compare the tumor volume sizes, and then they've split it out very nicely into these 3 different groups by the 2 different study design types, you can see that for the ones that were on just conventional, it went up a little bit in 2 of the 3 groups. But then look at the differences in the people that had the standard therapy plus the BioBrand. I mean, you can talk about anywhere from a 25% to a 40% and 36 in between changes in the size of these tumor volumes. So, I mean, just really dramatic improvements in these tumor volume sizes over the course of this intervention. And then if you look at these data, you see overall response to treatment. So you've got either a positive response, no response, and then an adverse response. And so obviously most of these people were having positive responses, but you can see that in the black, you have just the conventional therapy only. And then in the gray, you've got the conventional plus the rice bran. And you can see that that percentage of patients was statistically significantly different in favor of the rice bran. And then no difference between the groups that had no response. And then on the adverse side, you also have less adverse effects in people who were taking the BioBrand compared to people that were taking the conventional therapy. So really nice changes there or differences there in terms of being able to show, you know, the impact on either a positive response or a negative response. And then, of course, you know, for anybody that gets this terrible form of cancer, I mean, look at the survivability. So look at how over that first 12-month period, you've got a relatively, you know, not too divergent curve when it comes to how many people were living up to the 12-month mark. But then look at after 12 months, you can see the gray again is just conventional therapy alone, whereas in the black, you've got conventional therapy plus the rice bran. And so you can see as you follow this curve, it gets really bad around the 16 to 18-month mark. And then at 30 months, you've got no one who's still alive on conventional therapy, whereas all the way out to 36 months, you've still got a few folks who are alive who took the conventional therapy plus the rice bran. So to me, this was just a really beautiful study showing the benefits not only for you know, actually going through the process of treatment, but also for survivability. So with that said, I think I'll skip some of these others. And again, I'm happy to share this information with you because a lot of this is related to cancer, but I think just for the sake of time, since I'm kind of running out of gas a little bit myself, I'll just go ahead and skip down to the last where, you know, really, again, this is a very similar story to the allopolysaccharides. When you look at the hydrolyzed rice bran and all the different immune and inflammatory effects that it has, and then you have, you know, much the same thing, like we're not aware of any type of negative interaction or polypharmacy effect with taking, you know, a medication and then adding the hydrolyzed rice bran into that regimen. Much like the same thing with the polysaccharides as well, no hyporesponsiveness. So in other words, you know, it's just like oxygen and vitamins and minerals. Your body will utilize this material just like it does anything else that it can utilize for its functionality and to, you know, for the cells to work the way they're supposed to. So I would tell you guys that these polysaccharides, again, in my opinion, compared to just about anything else, maybe you could argue curcumin is more effective, but of course, as I'm sure all of you know, with curcumin, you have to very much pay attention to the formulation because it will rapidly metabolize by the liver. And if it's not encapsulated in a micelle or a liposome, then it's probably pretty worthless from a health perspective. But I mean, other than that, you know, I don't know what else you would talk about. Maybe vitamin C, maybe vitamin D. Obviously, many of the vitamins and minerals have been very well studied and they have, you know, great understanding for their effects. But anything else that comes from Mother Nature like this, of these very particular nutrients that are macronutrients biochemically, but they actually function like micronutrients, really, in terms of the way they have such dynamic effects on all of our cells. So again, you can't really get these from food. I don't buy into the argument of eating so much rice bran that you can get enough of that through your food to have a therapeutic effect. Certainly, I don't know about you guys. I don't know anybody who eats aloe vera interleaf gel, so that's a no-brainer as well. But again, I think these are so beneficial and they have such pleiotropic actions that you're really, you know, you're losing out on an opportunity. I won't say you're making a mistake. That's up to you to decide. But you are losing out on an opportunity to benefit from them based on all of this research that's been published if you don't include them in part of your daily routine. So with that said, I think I'll end it there. I just had a few other slides about some other phytonutrients that, again, I haven't worked with per se in running clinical trials, but they will be utilized: saffron, bilberry, curcumin that I mentioned, and I think that was it. But those are some materials that I will be working with in the future, and that's pretty much it. So here's my email address if you guys didn't get that, and my phone number. Happy to take any phone calls at any time. But thank you for your attention this evening. It's been a pleasure to be here with you guys again, and And I'm happy to work with you guys on any level you might find of an interest, and anything I can do to help you. I consider myself to be the kind of person that wants to be a servant to humanity. So anything I can do for you, I'd be honored and grateful to do that.
Thank you, John. That was great. Anybody
Thank
have any
you.
comments or questions?
I have a question here. I mean, I like the way that you are measuring the efficacy of this aloe vera polysaccharides with TH1 and TH2 and the ratio and balancing the immune system. I mean, this is something I'm very interesting as immune modulation field of medicine that's been overlooked by many doctors. So it's a practice for us actually, and we use Cyrex lab to do it. But the question is, you did not mention anything about TH17, because the old day we use TH1, TH2. We think that's the whole thing about autoimmune diseases, but really the core immune polarization that we need to look at is TH17, especially multiple sclerosis. So are you working on that, or do you have any investigation on the effect on TH17? Because that's more important than even TH1 when we talk about autoimmune diseases.
Yes, that's a great question. We actually have all of our samples saved. Unfortunately, we don't have the samples from the MS study, but we have all of our samples from the Alzheimer's study saved at the laboratory at the University of Miami. And they have, excuse me, some new equipment that includes the ability for us to look at all of the different TH17 biomarkers. And I'm in the process of trying to raise some money to do those analyses. I think I completely agree with you. It would be incredibly exciting and potentially very beneficial to do those analyses. So yes, that's definitely one of the things. You kind of read my mind. That's one of the things that I have planned for the near future that I hope that we're able to do. But like everything else in science, it requires money, right? I mean, you just can't do these things for free. So
I will help you with that if you connect with me, because that's what I'm also working with putting some sort of a platform of research and involved in protocols. But the other thing is that
fantastic.
in cancer we really need to have polarization to TH1, and so in cancer patients, they have low TH1, low cytotoxic T cells, and their immune system is polarized by the cancers themselves into TH17 and TH2. And so when we want to see the efficacy of aloe vera polysaccharide, we don't want to see it damping TH1. We want to see it damping mainly TH17 and possibly TH2. So
Gotcha.
that's something when you entertain cancer, that's exactly what we are looking for. So is that in your mind when you are going to look at the effect on cancers?
It is, absolutely.
John,
I
it
totally
was,
agree.
this is Dr. Patel. Just a thank you for your nice lecture. But for TH1 and TH2, you discuss most of the time the cytokines related to that. But I really didn't see any count of TH1 and TH2. And either you did put CD4, CD8, but there was not count. So did you really count that, or you just thought that they were polarized by those cytokines, and that's why you gave the cytokine ratio?
Correct. So we're, using the cytokines and growth factors is kind of like a proxy of the cell count, right? So we didn't look at that analysis. In fact, I'd have to go back and look at our data sets and see exactly which cell subsets we could count. But I thought it was very fascinating to look at the cytokines and growth factors just based on some of the other articles that I had read and, some of the other research that had been published. I was just kind of you know, I guess you could say piggybacking off of what some other groups had done in terms of how they were categorizing TH1 and TH2. And I thought it was pretty elegant to look at it that way, but I agree with you. There's a whole different way of looking at that we could certainly look into. And I think we do have a lot of those data. It's just a matter of, you know, as I mentioned to you guys, I'm not in academics full time anymore. I'm running a business. So academic publishing is probably not in my top 10 list of priorities as, you know, as a businessman trying to do what I do successfully, but
So what are
I
you
certainly
selling?
want, pardon me?
What are you selling?
All right, we can't,
What products?
hang
do
on,
you have?
Can we,
hang on.
yeah,
We can't, hang on, we'll get that afterwards.
Yes,
Just hang on there.
I want to be,
Okay, I'll tell you what, let's, we'll thank everybody, and we're gonna turn the